Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Object Class Dialogue, the show where your hosts, A Random Day
and Captain Kirby,
argue at each other and call it a podcast. On tonight's episode, Dialogue. Characters speaking to each other. How do you make them sound natural, especially in the unnatural context of an SCP? We decided to call in an expert on the topic, UraniumEmpire.
Hi.
Known for her articles such as SCP-5952 and tale series such as SYD. Thanks for coming on tonight, Yui.
All right, quick correction. SYD is a tale in the tale series, When Will You Die for the Last Time in My Dreams.
Already off to a great start, ARD.
Look, my job is to make you guys sound better.
Sorry, you were saying uranium?
Yeah, I'm UraniumEmpire. I've been writing for this site for, 7 years. What have I been doing? I've written a fuck ton of shit. And yeah, I'm apparently an expert at dialogue now.
Yeah, if we're calling you experts at dialogue, then that's the only title that matters.
Oh, God.
One thing I really love about your work is how you come up with such engaging villains. There's a special kind of exaggerated creepiness that feels frustratingly real. Like Key Lee and Pink Fly from the tale series about just girly things.
Honestly, a lot of that is just... Do you listen to Behind the Bastards?
I'm going to take a swing there.
You keep telling me to.
Podcast?
Yeah, shout out to Behind the Bastards, a podcast about the very worst people. Essentially, TLDR, these are real people, except they're monsters, like literal monsters in the fictional realm. The real monsters are like the loan sharks, the religious right, etc., etc.
Taking things that are real and then making them magically spooky. The part that resonates is the part that's real to everyone in the first place.
Yeah, give them a reason to also be afraid that, this person wants to take away your human rights and also eat your skin.
A lot of your works have a very strong political bent to them, which I approve of. How do you decide what kind of horror and what kind of real-world topic to fuse in your articles? How do you come up with that synthesis?
A lot of it is just like what's bothering me at the time, what I'm dealing with. 5952, the Warbalang, that's very much inspired by Behind the Bastards, me hearing about the religious right and thinking, oh God, these are the real monsters, and then making them the real monsters and making the physical monster less of a monster. There's also 4947, which it's not my best work, but that was very much inspired by me seeing my grandfather kind of lose it.
Oh, is that the worm where things just start disappearing, sort of, right?
Yeah, I find that a lot of this is just a way to process things.
A lot of writing can be taking things that are real and then trying to get people to understand them through a fictionalized version of it. You see a lot of stories based on a true story because if you just tell the true story straight up, it might still have all of the important ideas that are relevant and should be impactful to an audience, but the fictionalized version of it does some things to make it more accessible.
Yeah.
I wanted to touch a little bit more on real-world experiences, Yui. How would you say that, this real-world influence touches your characters? A lot of your recent articles focused on tackling, the religious right and also how, people in high positions of power are abusing it. How do you make their dialogue sound realistic? How do you use real-world touchstones to, affect the way they act and speak?
Kind of a two-pronged process. I'll generally hear either a quote or a video snippet from, say, Right Wing Watch of pastors praying for Trump, whatever, and I'll just get inspired. Then I'll think of I'll try to come up with the character archetype. How is this archetype talk? What got them to where they are? And I'll generally just go from there. This isn't going to make sense to anyone but me, but the best thing I can think of is moldy bread. The mold forms based on the bread, but the mold exists independent of the bread until it spawns on the bread.
I think that parses. I might ask a follow-up question that shows that I have no clue what you just said. Because a lot of the characters, especially in your SCPs, demonstrate personality through not just the things they say, but the way they are said. You see the mold on the bread, and that is the symptom of what caused the mold. The icky part that you see is the mold, not necessarily the bread underneath.
Yeah.
When you sit down to write a transcript of one of these characters, how do you take specific aspects of their personality and try to fit that into the dialogue itself?
I'd like to shout out Dolphin Slugsugar for like making me realize this. I'd actually been like thinking of this since like I think at least 2014 when I was in the Origins RP. If you want to get better at dialogue, essentially just join an IRC RP and make like 3 characters and try to nail their dialogue. Come 2018, there was this Gamers Against Weed article that I liked it at the time because I didn't know the Gamers Against Weed characters, and apparently it got them all wrong. There's a character named Bones. It is a kill satellite that decided that it did not understand Homestuck, but its spotter device, who transitioned to be female, likes Homestuck, so it will tolerate humanity and it will moderate the Discord. So one of Dolphin's criticism was Bones does not say fuck. That got me thinking, when should a character say fuck? I think there's a rule of thumb that I put. If you want to really quickly decide, how does this character speak? Determine what circumstances cause them to say fuck, how often it happens, and basically go from there. There's a few articles where I like go full in with like the PG-13 F-bomb trope where you like use it once. And I have to plan out, why is this character saying it now? How do they speak otherwise? Like A Dove in a Chicken Pen, which is an article about Ambrose Hooters and also the Davites, because I'm like that. Mr. Green is a character who I envisioned as just always in control of the situation, kind of smug, always a little bored. Part of it was just emphasizing at one point, this character really fucking hates, I don't want to say Jews, because like the guy is older than like the term Judaism. He hates the Canaanites, the people of Canaan. So what do you think is going to happen? And with an unnatural fluidity, Mr. Green climbed onto the table and towards Daniel when those filthy fucking Canaanites figure out the initiative has been fleecing them out of power. So I just have to think, what gets him really mad? And a lot of that is thinking, when he talks about something, how does he talk about it? How does it affect how he talks about it?
Picking a time and place for your characters to drop F-bombs is an exceedingly creative way of devising character dialogue, and I'm going to have to try that at some point.
A lot of how I do it is planning the emotional arc of the story. One of my favorite things to do is like when a character is drunk, when they're getting really angry, when they're getting worked up, their dialogue style, I like to change it up a bit because they're not going to speak the same all the time. Like when Mr. Green talks about how much he fucking hates the Canaanites, he's not going to use the same intonation as when he's being smug to a preacher.
I do something kind of similar. I think a lot about scene beats and story beats. There's probably a more strict definition that's more widely accepted, but the way that I'm going to describe it for this context is that a beat in a story is usually when there's a large change in the dynamics between the characters and the objective, or between characters and each other. And then in a scene, the scene beat is essentially when the mood, the tone, the way that the characters are thinking about the scene changes. When you want to have dialogue like evolve with the character, you need to think about what parts of the scene are going to cause a character to start thinking about a scene differently. And then you kind of can extrapolate that to stories as well. A really solid example, at least from my own stuff, an early tale that I wrote called Numbers Like Stories Never Die. There's a section where a bunch of D-class are going through and giving examples of stories from an old friend of theirs who they presume has died. The stories start out kind of jocular, and then eventually there reaches a point where someone starts telling a story that was much more closely related to them, as in like they were actually there for it and they knew this person a bit better. And that was a moment where you had a scene beat. And at that point, the dialogue kind of changes from making these jokes, it's kind of snarky, the lines are a little snappier, to a bit more drawn out, the lines get a little longer, there's a lot more genuine emotionality behind the lines, and people are kind of reaching for their thoughts a little more. Things like that, where you're looking at a scene and you're saying, at this point, the characters would not act the same way as they did prior to this point. Usually you want to embody that not just in the content of the conversation, but also in the way that the dialogue is flowing at that point.
Oh yeah, definitely. The way I approach like dialogue when it's relevant to a scene is like I'll generally have the characters start out saying something and I'll generally develop the conversation as it goes, but I'll try to gently nudge it to some of the points I wanted to make.
Hmm.
Something else I've been like trying to consider more often in my dialogue, body language and like how we act while we're speaking, what we're doing is also like a huge part of a conversation. Using a character's actions to reinforce and pace their dialogue, using to accentuate a scene and a mood, can all be really effective ways of cranking up intensity in a scene just as much as actual words can do.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's especially important when you're doing like a POV character. At that point, the narration kind of acts as a soft dialogue. This is what they're telling themselves in third person, mind you, and you need to adjust it appropriately with the mood of the scene.
I also love it when stories make the narrator themselves a character. Using POV narration is a challenge because you have to be balancing like what your character is saying with what they're narrating, which can be two entirely different things.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I treat this like the POV is what the main character is noticing and what they're thinking to themselves. And then when they speak, some of their actions they're doing that on purpose. Like when it says that Sarah's like putting a fucking hand on like Bihan's, I wrote SYD, which is like me fucking shipping one of my characters with an old ass author avatar and then just breaking them up at the end.
Because happy endings are for cowards.
This series is not going to end happy.
I know I've told you this a lot, but one thing I really like about your dialogue is how much it reminds me of like mumblecore, how much it relies on inserting natural stumbles, pauses, and other forms of speech cadence into the dialogue to make everything feel a little bit more naturalistic. We talked about this with the Great Hippo when we brought him on.
We did.
But I find that it adds verisimilitude to the dialogue. It just sort of makes the conversation feel more raw than more polished dialogue where like everything is sort of ending the way it's supposed to be in a script.
There's an interesting balance to kind of pull between making your dialogue sound really clean and making it sound real. Because one of the issues, as ARD knows from editing this podcast, is that people stumble and they stutter in places that aren't sexy. Sometimes you can stumble and stutter in places that really build character or make a lot of sense in context of a conversation, but the real way that people talk is nowhere near as nice as you actually want it to be. But you also shouldn't make your dialogue too clean, because then it won't sound anything like what people say, and that's a problem in and of itself.
I think a good way to think about this is like the sexy part of your dialogue, what the character is saying is just what the character is saying. The stumbling, the ers, the the ums, the ellipses, that's what they're not saying. There's probably a reason they're not saying it, and you can convey to the reader a lot of information just by when they stumble, when they repeat themselves, when they cut themselves off, etc., etc., etc.
You can do a lot of character building, not just like in what they say, but in how they say it. One thing I picked up from the author Elmore Leonard is that all of his characters have some sort of accent that comes through a little bit in their speech. I love having all of my characters use like slang. When it comes to my Tale series Speed Demon, the rookie uses so much British slang. Mobile Task Force Tau 5 Samsara, everyone's favorite magic clone cyborgs, whenever they're saying like longer multi-syllabic words that I don't think they'd have heard before, I deliberately insert ellipses to make it seem as though they're pausing and like processing the word in their head before they say it. Oh. I know a lot of people don't necessarily pick up on that sort of detail, but it helps make a character's dialogue sound internally consistent and it helps flesh them out that little much more.
Yeah, it's what I imagine Hippo would have said. Verisimilitude, your characters need to feel real. I don't remember what point I was making.
When it comes to inserting stutters and cadences and like pauses and stuff, you don't need to do that. The Great Hippo is trying to present a lot of horrible stuff in as banal, flatly, and as realistically as he can present it. And having all this cadences and stutters and stuff appear in like recorded footage and like playbacks and recordings, I don't think he does it that much in like interview logs and stuff. He does it a lot less than you might think.
Yeah.
The key thing to know with like these stutters and cadences is that you don't want it to interrupt active character moments, which I think comes back to what you were saying, Yui, in that stutters and cadences are important, but only because they're touching off on what the character's not saying.
Yeah. I think another great thing Hippo does, which I don't see a lot of authors do and which really makes me sad, he weaponizes not just dialogue, he weaponizes the SCP prose, the prose of the documents, and in a way that's also kind of dialogue. this is how the organization speaks. Like, a lot of the people, I think, fall into the trap of thinking the SCP is just a framing device, and therefore you don't need to worry too much about characterizing them. You can just make them generic. And like, Hippo is one of the few people I think who like really captures the fact that the Foundation is are a bunch of absurd control freaks who are kind of fucking ridiculous about it.
One of the big differences, though, that I would contend between the SCP format itself and dialogue is that dialogue is inherently back and forth. There's inherently interaction in dialogue. It's not a monologue, it's dialogue. That is, to me, like very important because dialogue serves a very like unique purpose in not just characterizing any individual character, but characterizes both in the way that they interact with each other. I put a lot of value in character interaction. You can see that from reading pretty much any of my shit. Like, it's a bunch of fucking dialogue and it's a whole lot of characters interacting.
End of Death fucking rules.
Thank you. Even my non-end of death stuff is fuck ton of character interaction because character interaction is how you develop a character outside of their own head, their own little bubble of them. If you don't have a character interact with another character, it's harder to demonstrate the actions speak louder than words, even though dialogue is words. You get to see how those words form in the presence of someone else. If someone thinks they would do something and then they say another, that tells you a lot more about that character than if you just heard their thoughts.
Yeah, one thing, but with 5952, that's kind of something I tried to do with, like, Pastor Warbler. In the first interview, spoilers if you haven't read it, he's very jovial, kind of playful, though he does get serious a bit. And then, like, in the August 6th log, when he talks to Ford is lower ranking. They're black, and Warbler's part of the religious right, like, probably wouldn't respect Ford. In here, he's more standoffish, rude, because he knows he can get away with it. And also, he doesn't fucking respect Ford at all. And I guess he shouldn't respect Beloso either. Like, spoilers, Beloso is Filipino. I don't know.
A lot of just demonstrating how they change around different people can do a lot for a character. You can do that a lot through the dialogue. You can have someone be very witty and sharp with one character, and then they become very timid or like feel like they're stepping on eggshells around another character. And that's going to immediately tell you a lot about their inner feelings toward them without necessarily having to put those inner thoughts right on the page. Because that's one of the big things you can't really do in an SCP format. You can't really do interiority. You need to show it all through your dialogue and the choices that the characters make.
I think to a large extent, the proliferation of like notes at the end and like journal entries and dialogue entries is a means for authors who are trying to get that interiority into their piece, but can't come up with a good way to do it.
You say proliferation, and I just think this was a thing back in 2013 when I wrote 2677. I thought, oh God, I can't do a note at the end. And I just did a note at the end because I wasn't as good as a writer.
That is the issue with a good number of notes at the end, is that they're just an excuse for interiority. Not that there aren't good notes at the end. They're just far and few in between.
There's this article I have been hunting for like 2 years since I read it about an extra dimensional space that was like filled with bodies, and the way the space was found was via a note at the end. And the reason I love this article to bits is because the note implies that a serial killer was dumping his like catch in the spot and just wanted someone to know about it.
Let me check, because I know there's like apparently James Franklin is a serial killer.
I find it really funny that you've been looking for this for so long, yet you haven't just written it since you haven't found it yet.
No, that's the thing. It exists. I know it exists because I've read it, but I can't remember the number.
God, this just reminds me of, like, I have this idea of making, like, a Christmas special. I'm Jewish for the record, so this is, like, very rare for me. About, like, some fucking kid who gets lost in the forest. There's a zombie reindeer, and then he meets, like, some lich who, like, pushes him away, but then eventually reveals his sad backstory. Like, he was cursed by a forest spirit after he chopped down some trees to make a house for him, specifically because there was this wild fucking Christmas special that I remember reading, and I can't fucking remember it, and I just want someone to notice this and think, hey, you're ripping off that so I can watch it again, for God's sake.
'Tis the season to be merry.
Oh God. I love this season. I put up like a bah humbug sort of exterior, and then I just, in the background, I just be fucking Santa for like the whole season, because that's the only way I get happiness out of this season, pretending to be Santa. And people like it, and then I love this season.
It's great.
Yeah, speaking of merry things, the more the merrier. Especially in like articles like SCP-5952 or all your Tales series. How do you juggle the dialogue of having like so many different characters? How do you make sure they all stay distinct? Because I have like trouble getting more than 3 characters to remain relevant in any given situation. But you seem to juggle like 5 at a time.
I'm glad you think that, because I've recently been thinking, oh god, are Sarah and Veronica too similar? They're bisexual Jews with borderline personality disorder. But I try to make
more
them
to
different.
a character than your labels.
Yeah, there's more to it. I think a lot of it is just like recognizing this character is from a different situation. Like Sarah is drunk, constantly strung out because she has to work all the time, just wants to take things fine. Jack is constantly holding back pure fucking scarlet rage at all times. Izzy adapted to being originally the socially awkward person by pretending to be English. Technically is English, but like she moved to Texas before she could like develop the accent. I really want to like include that later, that just Izzy is fucking faking her accent.
Okay, first off, I love that because I thought she was actually British. Second of all, how much of this backstory how much are you like thinking about it? How actively does it influence your moment-to-moment writing of each character's dialogue?
Kind of depends on like the character. With the House of Spades crew, it kind of helped that, like, with the exception of Jack, Izzy, Sarah, and Veronica were already based on like past characters, and I could draw back from the backstory that I had developed for them. Honestly, I think it might just be the fact that I'm autistic and like I remember a lot of this stuff because it interests me. I guess if we're talking with like 59, 52, the backstory didn't actually come up a lot. It was more that I knew how these characters felt about their jobs, what they were trying to do, etc. So like I could draw back on like Ford is hiding the fact that she's a black trans woman who is kind of stuck in some creepy small town neo-Confederate fuckery. Then there's like Beloso and like Watley. They don't feature too much, but I do like what I did with them. They're kind of the same age, but like Beloso is like, he's kind of new to being a team lead, so he tries to be serious even though he isn't that. And then there's Watley, who is like, he's used to the anomalous, he's just a guy who's there, so he allows himself to like be more jovial about things.
I think that makes sense. You're putting your characters in these situations and then you're asking yourself, based on what you like know and came up with them, how are they reacting to this situation?
Yeah.
That's the part of like dialogue that I have the most trouble with, because I'm usually coming up with these characters on the fly based on how they're reacting.
Yeah.
It's always kind of interesting when you like sit down and be like, okay, this is why this character said this thing in this exact way. I have that with some of my lines of dialogue. With other lines of dialogue, I'm like, yeah, that just seemed like the right thing to do at this point. I can't quite justify it. But being able to justify it creates like a nice coherency and flow to the entire dialogue that might not shake out if you just kind of zen it.
Sometimes when I'm writing a villain, I find that I don't even think about like that. I just think about this villain has an agenda, they want something, they need to present themselves as something if they need to get away with something.
Oh yeah, I'm a big fan of like layered dialogue, especially in the case of an article like SCP-4886, where, spoiler alert, the helpful Foundation agent who's like leading the investigation is actually the serial killer monster who's responsible for said investigation.
Oh god, I loved writing that one. I actually went into that thinking, I'm going to write this character as kind of two things. One, as like the jovial like agent who's been doing this for a while, just wants to be the hero. And also like, I really want the reader to read this again, this guy's dialogue, what he does, and think, oh my god, what the fuck are we enabling? What the fuck? What the fuck? This is horrible.
Yeah, so this is like a much more planned out kind of dialogue where you have to know ahead of time exactly what this guy is saying and like why. I want to know how you ideated Agent Lancelot from like top to bottom.
Okay, so first of all, I knew that Lancelot, he's a jack, or as I like to call them, a covenant, which means he fucks things and he creates horrible monster spawn. So part of that was just thinking, this dude has now ingratiated himself in the Foundation. I think one thing I'm proud of, the entire time, Lancelot isn't actually all that perturbed about everything that's going on, even though it kind of fucking sucks. I tried to play it off like he's seen this a lot. He's been this, he's dealt with this. And like the only other character who can also say they've done that is Glines, who, spoiler alert, is killed at the end and may also be complicit in some cover-up.
Rip my man Glines.
I mean, he was named Griffith.
R.I.P. Glines.
A lot of it was thinking, like, and also, like, the fact that this dude is 12,000 years old. This dude has lived through some shit. He's lived through so much that he's basically has to develop his own way of speaking, and it's kind of awkward. It's a bit too jovial. He does the radio voice. A lot of it was just, he treats this like a game. It was knowing that his motivation here, yeah, he has the urge to, like, create his spawn, but, like, on top of it, he's a fucking narcissistic serial killer who wants to be regarded as a hero, and a violent fucker who likes killing things. He farms and kills his own children. This isn't something he's doing as a cover. This is something he wants to do, and so he's having fun with it. And because he's having fun with it, he gets to have fun with how he talks about things, even if it's like, yeah, you're a bit weird, but I'll just write this off as the fact that you lived in a fucking Nexus all your life.
One of the things that I find makes villains different to write from just anything else is that you can start from, I get to write something that's fucked up, and you kind of get to start by crafting this really fucked up idea. And then you get to let that play into your dialogue. That's a skill on its own, being able to write something that's sufficiently fucked up that also can play out nicely on a page. But then, like, it's very different from writing a lot of other characters, because with other characters, you don't get to start from fucked up. You have to start from, compared to villains, relatively close to normal. You have to pick something that people will somewhat relate to, because the point is that they're not the villain. The point is that they're, like, not, again, super normal, but for a main character that you're following, usually you want them to be closer to something that's realistic, and you have to figure out how to make that more realistic thing multifaceted.
There's basically two ways to write villain dialogue. The villain as a character and a villain as a force. For example, a villain as character, last minute resistance, part of Black and White and Red all over. The protagonist is a horrible person. He is the villain of the story. He tries to basically set off a magic bomb at, like, a block party as part of some fucked up Nazi war effort. Because this dude is, like, the POV character, I had to treat him as any other protagonist. So a lot of this was just thinking, okay, this character, he became a Nazi because he had a breakdown when he was 18. He felt really fucking inadequate, and, like, PUA was how he felt good about himself, and the PUA to Nazi pipeline, that's a thing. And then there's, like, 5952, Elder Rockwell, or the Unknown Man, as he's referred to. You have to think of this dude as, like, this dude is here to do something that I do not want the reader to know yet, but that the reader should be able to pick up on when they reread. How do I have them say things without making it very obvious that, oh god, this dude is trying to embolden the religious right? Like, Elder Rockwell, he talks about his philosophy, and part of what I tried to do is just word it in a way that was palatable. But if you actually examined what he was talking about, especially in the context of what he does, like, spoiler, he's part of some, like, far-right Christian Scarlet King syncretism. The dude's talking about, like, God's love in abstract as something that just happens. And he slips in some things about how too much of God's love can fucking hurt you. All that warmth, it's pretty bad, so you need the dark stuff to appreciate the warmth. He's talking about the Scarlet King being used to better appreciate supply-side Jesus's quote-unquote love, but, like, he doesn't say it outright. You just need to know that he's talking about it. Like, he knows he's talking about it, and he does not want the person to, like, catch on, because, like, if they catch on, they really recognize, oh god, this dude is the problem.
Writing a POV character that's not supposed to actually be a sympathetic character, you don't necessarily want the reader to understand that at first go. I've written some stuff offsite where you're following a main character who is actually just a piece of shit Your character may or may not know why they're a piece of shit. You as an author know why he's a piece of shit. But the key is that you don't need to bring that to the audience's attention directly until a moment of climax or at the end of the story. You can early on. That's a choice that you can make. It usually makes reading the character a little harder for people because it's harder for them to stay with a character that they actively hate. But if you can like make someone hate the character that they've been reading at like the very end of the story or towards the end of the story, then that's a fairly effective way to make a character who's unsympathetic still feel enjoyable to read.
Yeah, I think it's very important that if you have like a main character that's a horrible fucking piece of shit, that by the end, you need to make the reader know that even if they do have bad intents, even if they know that they want to hurt people, there's a reason they're doing that. It might not be a good reason, but the reason makes sense to this person, and they're going to think to themselves and talk to other people as if it does make sense, as if this is a good thing. Part of them might also know that, like, I'm not just gonna fucking tell people. It's the principle of sometimes it's better not to say things directly because at the moment, other people are not going to take to that. One of the big themes, like I tried to do with Black and White and Red All Over and Filled to the Brim, is basically just show how does this spread? How do these people self-propagate? Because when you get down to it, fascism, turfism, fucking inceldom, they're not just singular fucking beasts. It's not good to think of them as beasts. You should think of them as like virus. Fascism is not a monster, it is a virus that incubates in people who are vulnerable and comes out with something that is fucking terrible, but something that you can trace a line to why this person became a fascist and trace a line to how the virus is going to spread, and if your characters know that, they can fucking stop that.
It makes a lot of sense, especially when you're writing those sort of topics, mostly because there's a lot of powerful stories to be written about those sorts of things. But if you don't know what you're doing, it's very easy to write them wrong, not just ineffectively, but also wrong as in not portraying them as what they really are.
Yeah, there's two problems when you're writing, like, this isn't even dialogue anymore, but there's two problems when you're writing this shit.
Sorry, our first question was about your villains. We didn't even start with dialogue. It's fine.
You don't want to write a story where the bad guys come out in the right. If the bad guys are representing something that is wrong, you don't want to come out with like this sympathetic guy where you don't properly explore how he got there and how the thing he's doing is not just bad, but like one thing I really wanted to show that like in fascism is not only is this thing bad for other people, it doesn't even get you what you want. You can get slow close to winning. You can do a lot of damage. You can do so much damage, but these people will never win because they'll never get what they want. They'll never get what they went into fascism for. Like Alonso will never be accepted just by making a bomb. Bastian will never come to terms with the fact that he's gay by beating up anti-fascists. Theresa will never be able to rationalize her worldview just by gassing people with black fly. These people will never be happy until they realize that, and some of them will never realize that. But to get back to this thing, the second thing you don't want to do is just... I see a lot of criticism leveled to say just girly things as is, because it's the TERF GOI, and I have thoughts on like, why calling it the TERF GOI, TLDR, call them fucking tradfems. TERF is a very specific thing, and TERFs love it when you muddle the term TERF, because it successfully obfuscates them when they think, oh no, we're just concerned, like the punch TERF mentality. That's how you get transmisogyny exempt people who are just saying punch TERFs to actually listen when TERFs are being quote unquote rational and take in what they're saying because, oh shit, I didn't think this person was human. So yeah, if your villain is sapient, your villain is human. They have agency, what they're doing is wrong, and even if they have a reason for doing it, it might not work out for them. Your character has a human way of interacting with the world, and I think that's what dialogue is about. Having a character interact with the world consciously, unconsciously, etc.
Well, I gotta say, Yui, I very much enjoyed interacting with you and Kirby tonight. I was especially fascinated by your take on how these characters' backgrounds affect what they are and aren't saying, and how these characters' like internal conflicts affect their external conflicts and the way they show themselves to the world.
God, I didn't even get to 3721. I think this is one of those things where I just broke all the rules. But yeah, it's like Hippo said, there's a lot of rules in writing, but the only rule you need to really worry about, do not waste your readers' time. Do not waste their fucking time. Do what you need to do. Get out.
As is tradition, all good podcasts end by coming back to Hippo.
I always like to say, don't write what you can get away with not writing.
There's many iterations on it. Make sure that you're writing something worth reading is a good way to look at
That's
it.
always going to be a constant, Kirby. Uranium Empire, thank you for joining us tonight and sharing your insights into character. Everyone, thank you for listening to Object Class Podcast.
Flint, Michigan still does not have clean water.
Flint, Michigan needs clean water. You heard it here first, folks.
No, hopefully you didn't, but...
And on that note, thank you and good night.